Welcome to Uncertain Things. This is Adaam, and I am joined today by returning guest, Yuval Levin, Senior Fellow at AEI. Yuval, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you very much for having me again.
Listeners, first of all, I should tell you, I think I mentioned it in the email, but I think our conversation with you was one of our most listened to episodes. So our audience loves you. So there's that. And they may remember that we spent a good deal of time talking about your book, your dissertation, the great debate about the different worldviews presented by Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke about what is a healthy revolution and the role of institutions. So this is going to play a part, I think, in our discussions, but we'll see. But I specifically invited you to talk about, I guess, how both of us responded to or addressed the 4th of July. I think we both had similar, many others had similar consternations swirling in our heads about the role of preservations. I wrote a piece that Uncertain Things subscribers may have read about laying out my concerns about what's driving our society mad right now. And you gave a talk to the Tikva Fund, also speaking about similar concerns, I would say, although albeit different. And I will start with your take, and then we can start going back and forth a little bit about it. So broadly speaking, you highlighted the concern of what you called the enemies of social continuity, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one way to understand the challenge that we understand as the challenge of the modern cultural left is that it is a group of Americans overrepresented in some of our elite institutions who do not value the continuity of our institutions, who don't think that the world we inherited is the world we ought to want to leave behind, if a little better, but who think that the world we inherited is a burden on ourselves and the next generation, and that what's incumbent upon us and what we should require of political life is a break the traditions we inherited that might allow us to start over, to build something else that would make a closer approach to justice. And that as a practical matter, a lot of the people that I find myself arguing with in public life are people who are hostile to the task of cultural continuity, who don't think the problem we confront is how do we sustain and preserve the best of what we have, but who think the problem we confront is how do we liberate ourselves from what we have. And, you know, a lot of our politics, just as in a straightforward way, is a fight between people of those two views. But I think it's worth our seeing that ultimately the challenge that so often confronts us is a challenge of continuity, of how do we improve without a break, and therefore of how do we keep the good while addressing the bad. And that seeing it that way gets at a lot of the deepest differences that separate left and right these days.
I want to make sure that we don't elide the subtlety that you've emphasized, which is that continuity doesn't mean ossifying, doesn't mean freezing in amber, a specific state of society.
I think that's exactly what it doesn't mean. In fact, continuity is the only way to really make durable change, because if we break with what we have, then we have to start over. And this, I would say, is really an essential insight of modern conservatism, that the means to progress is actually through a kind of evolutionary process that requires conservation, that requires us to begin from where we are, build on what we have, draw on the lessons that we didn't learn ourselves, but that were learned by people before us, and try to improve on the civilization we inherited from them. The purpose of that conservation is improvement. It's not to stay exactly where we are forever. The question is, how do you improve? And one answer says you improve by throwing off what you have and starting over in a better way. The other answer says, well, that's what a return to a primitive past looks like. That's not what moving forward looks like. Moving forward looks like learning from the process that got us here and applying it to what we need now.
My mom years ago wrote an essay that I really appreciated in the context of Israeli culture debates. And I think we're going to touch that a little later. But she titled this in response to the Hanukkah question of the Hellenization of Jewish culture. As anybody who's familiar with the story of Hanukkah knows that the real war was not between Jews and Greeks, but really between Jews and the Hellenized Jews internally. And my mom had the essay titled Hityavnut, which is the Hebrew word for Hellenization, or Itnavnut. Hityavnut or Itnavnut, so, which means either Hellenization or decay.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important thing, that your version of conservatism, you called it modern conservatism, and I might let you unpack that a little bit, but your version of conservatism is one that accounts for the importance of evolvement, of evolution, of growth, but within the strictures of historical institutions, past tradition, and that link between past generations and a commitment to creating a way for future generations, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I would say for me, it's rooted in a sense of the limits of our knowledge. We don't have anything approaching perfect knowledge of how to make a perfect world. What we have is knowledge gained by trial and error, a long, long stretch of trial and error, of generation after generation, trying to do essentially the same thing, which is to live well, raise good kids, and give them a chance to thrive. That's what we do. That's what our parents did. That's what their parents did. And in the course of doing it for generations, our society has learned a variety of things about how we might do that. To abandon what it's learned, to abandon the institutions and the beliefs and the frameworks and the modes of life that we've built up and start over, is to throw away the achievements of that civilization. You wouldn't do that unless you thought you had the answer that all those generations don't. And I don't think we do. I don't think we are in a place to know all that much more than those prior generations. We don't know less either. I don't think there was a golden age that we're trying to reach back for and recover. But I think we learn gradually by trial and error. And that means that the first thing we should be sure we do is to preserve the results of that trial and error. Some of it is knowledge, explicit knowledge, but a lot of it is just practices and institutions and things we do for reasons that I'm not entirely sure of, but that I'm not prepared to throw in the garbage either, because it's perfectly clear that they're here for a reason, and we only learn that reason over time.
Let's stay in this more abstract realm of trying to understand what conservatism means and what it doesn't mean. Also, what does, let's call it, progressivism or revolutionaryism means and doesn't mean? It goes to the paradox of the Enlightenment period and the modern era, really, because the modern era, it feeds on the sense of growth and rapid change, technological change, cultural revolutions, and all of them rooted in the accumulation of human knowledge, which, in other words, means we now know so much more than previous generations. Previous generations couldn't send rockets to the moon. Previous generations didn't succeed in creating a political republic like the American system that has been able to withstand this long. Even maybe, I don't know, the Roman Republic didn't really withstand as a republic for so long, arguably. Why shouldn't we believe that we now know better? We can see experientially that there are things we know now that we didn't in the past. Why shouldn't we assume that our technology, that our accumulated knowledge actually has given us new tools to start over and do away with prejudices and old practices that are just vestigial, and now design a human society that is happier, more thriving, more equal, more just?
Well, here I think the question is really, what do we mean by we know more? And a great guide on this front is Friedrich Hayek, who in the first few chapters of The Constitution of Knowledge, his book from the mid-1960s, really takes up this question. And he says, it's easy to believe that we now know more. We clearly are doing things that have never been possible before. But the fact is that that knowledge is, in fact, the accumulated experience of those prior generations. We as individuals don't know more than individuals did in prior generations. In some ways, we know less because we know a smaller part of the overall knowledge of our society. It's much harder for a modern person to survive on his own than it was in prior ages, because to survive, we depend on all kinds of things that we don't understand at all. He says, you wake up in the morning and you flip the light switch and it goes on. Can you tell me how? No one can tell you how. Very few people can. And those people don't know anything about any other thing that happens in the modern world that makes their life possible. The way we know is in a decentralized and dispersed way that is contained in the institutions of our society, so that to begin to make progress by overthrowing those institutions is to begin trying to make progress by overthrowing the results of progress. It's a return to primitivism. It's not, in fact, a way to progress. There is an alternative way of understanding the modern world, which I think of as the kind of progressive view, which says that our knowledge is technical knowledge. It can be centralized. We do possess it. We know more. There's no reason why we now have to suffer with the difficulties of the human past. If you can send a man to the moon, why can't we cure poverty? I think that view is a misunderstanding of the modern achievement. I would say that conservatism, the alternative to this kind of progressive view, is actually also a modern view. In fact, conservatism and progressivism, as I think about them, differ especially about what modern liberal society is. The progressive view is the more familiar view to us. It says modern liberalism emerged from a set of discoveries in the Enlightenment that allowed for a new way to organize society. It is more just, it's more representative, and it means we should abandon everything that came before it. Conservatism says the liberal society is the result of a very slow evolution over time, especially in Britain, but not exclusively, in the direction of free institutions that balance order and justice and individual liberty in a sustainable way. That this happened over a very long stretch. It was not invented in the Enlightenment. It's not a product of new ideas alone. It's a product of a gradual evolution of expectations and practices. So I think, for example, of the beginning of Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where in the introduction, he gives you a 1,000-year history of liberalism that doesn't even mention the Enlightenment. Maybe that's a little excessive and he was doing it on purpose, but he's got a point. We actually live now in the modern liberal world with an evolved order that was not, John Locke did not invent England. He described an existing society in a different way for a particular reason, but we shouldn't imagine that political life is just applied political ideas. Political life is evolved political practice too. And the best of our society has a lot to do with that.
So the conservative conception that you're describing of liberalism is much more narrow and also to some extent more parochial, which makes sense because by the nature of this view, ideas don't evolve in the Kantian way of discovering the objective universal imperative within your rationality as a human, but rather by local practices that then get scaled up.
Yes, that's right. Now, I think there is a place for ideas in the Kantian sense, for the truth in this idea, but the trouble has to do again with the limits of human knowledge. And here I really follow Edmund Burke. Burke believes that there is a truth underlying social life, but that we approach that truth through practice, through trial and error. And that in a sense, over time, by rubbing up against that truth in very difficult ways that force us into all kinds of crises, society comes to take the shape of that truth. And in a sense, we learn about the nature of what's true about the human person and justice through the example, through the shape of our institutions, because they've taken shape in an effort to advance those ideals over time. Now, this is only true in a functional society. I don't think North Korea can learn from its own institutions about the truth about the human person. But there are now a lot of these kinds of liberal societies. They're not all the same, but they've all taken shape over time in ways that have tried to gain a better understanding of how to live well. And they have a lot to learn from their own institutions and their own histories, not just from philosophy.
Why can't North Korean society learn some truth about human nature from their institutions?
Well, they can learn truths about human nature, I think, from their failures, but I think that there has to be some degree of permitting human flourishing for a society to be able to learn positive lessons. And look, most societies do this. I say North Korea because it's a really extreme example of what seems to me to be a profoundly oppressive state. There are a lot of different ways to learn. You know, when Burke criticizes the French revolutionaries, he doesn't say to them, well, instead, you should follow the English model. He says to them, instead, you should learn from the French model. You should learn from your own history how to flourish and thrive. He doesn't defend the king they hate. He says there's a better way, a better French way to do what you're trying to do. I think that's true for a lot of societies, and they don't all have to be the same. But there is a limit, and it does seem to me that it's possible for a state to be so oppressive that it makes social learning impossible for its people.
You know, I didn't expect to accuse you of coming close to critical legal theory, and yet here we are, because what you're saying starts scratching at the intuition expressed by some of the original writers of critical legal theory, be it Delgado or others, which is, it's really an indictment of the American liberal model of justice and a legal system that takes for granted some form of universality, while in truth being deeply rooted in a very localized, parochial, white English, predominantly male tradition, right? That is their criticism. And the implication is that being so rooted in tribal logic, it is not really fairly applicable. It cannot be scaled up to descendants of slavery. It cannot really be scaled up to other nations around the world in the great project of global liberalization, right? It sounds like you're not entirely disagreeing with that.
Well, I think that what happens over time in a society that enables that kind of human flourishing is that you do come closer and closer to genuine principles that describe the human person. And I think human nature really is a universal fact about us. Now, I don't think they're ever perfect at it. And I don't think you can take one society's regime and just apply it elsewhere and expect it to work in the same way. But the reason for that has to do with the fact that people's experiences are shaped by their communal history, not that the underlying ideals are not ultimately true of the human person. And so I think some of what they say is right, but it points in a different direction than they imagine. And more than that, I think critical legal theory tends to mistake law for philosophy and vice versa. And so to apply some constraints on what law can be to the very possibility of knowing anything permanent and universal about the human person, I think there are constraints on what law can be. And I think that some of those constraints are, you might say, parochial constraints. Law will look different in different circumstances and experiences. But I also do think that there are underlying truths. I do think that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. I think that's true. It's a very important truth to know. It's not a truth we've always known. It's not a truth that Plato and Aristotle knew. And the fact that we know it does allow us to have a more just and more free society. But how we get to that place and what it means to apply that in political terms, I think does have to partake of some humility about what human beings can know and do in politics.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, we arrive at these universal truths through our separated, localized journeys, but we are arriving at still some core human truth.
Yes.
And if that's the case, why can't that then be, once reached, why can't that be imposed universally? Why can't there be a central planner that says, well, now that we know that all men are created equal, and maybe now that we also have the tools, the technological tools to average out all of society's needs. We have AI. AI can tell us exactly what what the averages of the American population and maybe global populations prioritize. We know their food preferences, their choices in habitat. We know their pornographic preferences. We know so much about so many people. Why can't we take that, plus the universal discovered truth of what we might call the Jeffersonian declaration truths, right? The core of liberalism as universal truths. Mix them together and create the constitution of mankind, and then impose it imperialistically with a progressive bent on the rest of the world.
I think part of what we know about the human person is that part of what's required for us to be formed in the direction of a flourishing life is a certain amount of freedom and choice and control and agency, so that to apply what we've learned so far in a way that makes it impossible for us to learn any more is not a way to facilitate a functioning society. It seems to me one of the things we've learned is that human beings do need to be free in order to flourish. And that is a constraint on human power that is not simply a function of the fact that we haven't invented the technology capable of knowing even more about us. It's a constraint on human power that's actually rooted in what we do know. So I don't think we're going to have a technological way out of the need to have constraints on coercion. I think the need for those constraints is a function of what the human being is.
If I could force you to choose between two aspects of liberalism in that sense, in what you're describing, because I'm hearing two things, which I share, I should note, listeners know, but two core components of a liberal system is one, the innate value of choice, and second, the guardrail against mistake, the tool for course correction, right? That is part of all liberal systems, is to allow a system that can change and doesn't get stuck in case it makes a mistake. If you had to choose one of them for the system, will be the innate protection of choice, even if we know that we've reached a model that is perfect. Let's say a God comes down and says, here's the perfect model for all mankind. Impose it and thou shalt succeed. Should you still protect choice? Or vice versa, if you're saying that it's about trial and error, even if people are making their choice for a more tyrannical system right now, as often happens, masses can vote for a tyrant, and we don't want this choice anymore. We want a technological overlord, whatever the results are. We're tired of making our own moral choices. In that case, would you choose the error correction or respecting people's choice? So choice, innate value of choice, or course correction?
I do think that they're inexorably connected, but I don't think we can give up choice. I don't think we can give up choice, because ultimately to do that is also to give up the advantage of the other way. Human beings are never in a permanent final state, in no small part because we are a generational species like all others. We are born, we mature, we have children of our own, we die and pass away from the world. Those children have to rise and to mature and have their own children. And that means that the capacity for choice is essential as a part of how human beings form. We cannot have a world where that capacity is denied, where we can pretend that we know in a permanent way what everybody needs and what everybody wants. I just don't believe that it's possible for us to reach that state. And, you point to, in the example, to what if God came down and said this? Well, it seems to me that that's not a bad instance of exactly what I'm pointing to, which is, you might say God does know the answers, but he gives us free will because that is the answer. That's how every parent at some point encounters this kind of situation where you just think, I know he's making a mistake. I know he is. But the best thing to do is not, in fact, to step in, not allow that mistake to happen. That's just the only way to mature. We've all been the person making that mistake. We've all been the person seeing that mistake. And I don't think that we can live well if that option is denied us.
What if the mistake, as in my example, what if the mistake leads to the loss of choice down the line, potentially? What if the choice is 1933, Germany.
Yeah, look, I think in that situation, you want to try to be persuasive. You want to try to be as effective as you can in moving people to make better choices. I don't think that closing off the possibility of future choices is ever the way to improve society. That runs pretty deep for me. I mean, I think that's who we are.
So we try to define how you see conservatism. Now let's talk about the enemies of continuity. So I'm going to follow your lead. You describe them as more on the left, and you see them as what? The product of the progressive vision that we can start over and rebuild mankind? Is that how you recognize this pattern? Who are you talking about?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I have in mind, I would say, a lot of people who we understand now as progressives. And I think if I were to describe the chain of thinking that leads them to where they are, it probably begins from a different place than I do on the question of human nature. I mean, I think there's a sense that rather than imagining that we're fallen and prone to waywardness, they think we are ready to thrive, but are kept from thriving by oppressive powers in the world, by the rich, by the strong. That means that what we require from politics is liberation from these powerful forces, and that properly liberated will be free and will thrive. That's the logic of revolutionary movements from the beginning of the modern era. You know, not every progressive in America is a Jacobin, but I do think that there's an underlying assumption in much of the political culture of the left that says that essentially the fact that we were born into a world we didn't create is oppressive, and to the extent that we can mitigate that oppression, we should. That means we should absolutely maximize everyone's capacity to create their own universe, and therefore continuity is just imposed oppression by people who benefit from the status quo.
That's a fascinating definition. The fact that we live in a world that we did not create. So is that a form of radical individualism, that if you're not the autonomy of your moral system, then it is ipso facto immoral?
Yeah, I mean, I think the logic of a certain kind of progressive liberalism taken to its logical conclusion is that the fact that I'm not the first person in the world is an unfortunate reality that I have to live with. And the only way to have a just society is if we all were the first person in the world. Now, obviously, they don't live their everyday life with this assumption in mind, but I do think that at the end of the day, that means they reject the basic circumstances of human life. And it's why this mode of politics is so constantly in tension with our society.
But how do you reconcile that in your view of them with the fact that they have a tendency to be hyper-communitarian, to talk about groups, to be very tribal, literally communes, right? That's also a product of utopian leftism. How do you reconcile this version of hyper-individual solipsistic morality with communitarianism?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Rousseau resolves that problem for us early on in the story of the modern West, and suggests that there is a certain kind of communitarian that's natural to us and that is forced out of us by the artificiality of civilization. And that left to ourselves, we would form small communities that basically don't have politics and don't need politics because they agree with each other about everything. And that the fact of a divisive, combative politics is evidence of the corruption of life and society. I think that's actually not an exclusively left-wing view. That notion that it's possible to have a community in which there is agreement about everything is in fact increasingly evident in the modern right too. And there are people who imagine that that's what the little Greek polities were, for example. You have to ignore everything about classical Athens to believe that, but I think that there are people who think that way in our modern politics, and who essentially think that a politics geared to dealing with division is a politics that accepts failure at the outset, and that in fact we should treat moral diversity as a social failure. I think that's a very old idea. It's a very attractive idea. It strikes me as quite wrong.
goes back to a debate that I've been having with an artist friend of mine, Ken Goshen, and our friend and colleague, Jonah Goldberg, where we try to place what is the original sin of the modern era? Is it Rousseau or is it the Jacobins? And that's our great split.
I have to say this. Rousseau is brilliant.
For sure.
And has a lot to offer anyone trying to understand modern life. He's not a Jacobin. He's not simple-minded. But a lot of the dream that he offers becomes very easily corrupted into Jacobinism.
And that's why my view is that the real source is Jacobinism, because Jacobinism is the original read of Rousseau as a gospel of authoritarian destruction, annihilism. So my question, and this was the original premise for this conversation, you see these movements as trying to break continuity from that solipsistic urge of reimagining justice. I've grown more gloomy in recent years, and my essay for the 4th of July was about the trend that I, in a facile, half-joking way, called Annihilists, the form of nihilism that is actually actively trying to destroy, that is driven by the urge of deconstruction, that it is not deconstruction for the sake of creating my personal new moral space or my new authentic community, but rather that the destruction in itself is the driving urge. Do you think there's something to it?
Well, I think there's something to it, but I would say these things are connected. There is an underlying premise behind a lot of that kind of urge that if we just got rid of everything we're struggling with now, what would emerge in its place would be more natural and peaceful and equitable and just. In other words, that civilization is the problem, and that to burn it down would be to create space for a more just society. There's certainly people, I think, who don't need that second part, who just take enough satisfaction from the prospect of burning things down. But I guess I think they're a real fringe, and that to the extent that that a kind of progressivism is a broad-based movement, and I think it is, its appeal is rooted more in what it promises to construct than in what it promises to destroy. It's just that there's an assumption that the destruction and the construction are one, that the problem goes away when the institutions go away.
This is, I think, the source of my instinctive disagreement. Because when you look at history, the one model, the American liberal pluralistic model, showed results, showed actual progress, both materially, culturally, spiritually, on all fronts that the progressive mind claims to care about. And then the annihilist model has led to destruction. And my argument is that there is an aesthetic obsession with the French Revolution, with the symbols of the French Revolution that they have singed themselves in the Western mind, and not only the Western mind, as what a revolution really looks like. And the means really become the end. The waved fists, the torn flag, the blood, the guillotine, they become the goals of revolution. I quoted Marat in my little essay. It was one of the most stunning little discoveries that I found reading Carlyle. It's a little bit of history that I did not know, that after the September massacre, which is when the Paris Commune puts on a tribunal to judge the loyalists of the crown, and those who are found guilty are executed by the guillotine. Those who are found not guilty, those who are acquitted, go through the second hallway to be jumped on by the masses, by the mob, and killed by spikes and clubs. And that model of this is the proper justice, and then there's the backdoor justice, but you all get the same Bane-like justice, Bane from Batman. And Marat, who is this voice of the revolution, friend of the people, writes a letter that's the part that I did not know. He circulates a letter to the other municipalities of the revolution, commenting about these events, saying not that be careful from, going too far, don't like hold it. No, what he says is, I hope you all look at this example as the true form for national salvation. And that's the phrase that he uses, national salvation. He sees indiscriminate bloodshed and mob violence and gets inspired enough to exhort the rest of France to see this as national salvation. And I think there's a quality of human nature expressed in his behavior that has been so seductive to Western history, that exhilaration of destruction that I think overrides any kind of real, logical considerations about what kind of future we're trying to build, but rather, how do we find redemption through violence?
Yeah, look, I that's undeniable. It seems to me at some level, and it's also a theme of kind of anti-revolutionary writing for a long time. It's almost everything George Orwell had to say in the second half of his life is on this subject. I think Animal Farm is a great reflection on exactly the point you're making. The idea that the evidence offered up for the effectiveness of these tactics is the tactics. That is, it's proof of our will to act, of our willingness to actually do it, and that's the thing to admire. I think there's no doubt that that's true for many people involved in these kinds of terrible revolutions. But there's always also a vision of a tomorrow in these things that speaks to a lot of people. I don't think these things can be totally separated. And that, the idea that at the end of this is some kind of previously unimaginable perfect society is part of the appeal, is an important part of the story. It's not possible to persuade people that the American model achieved that, because it didn't achieve that. It didn't achieve the perfectly just society. If your expectations are so high that that's what it would take, then it isn't really possible for classical liberalism to meet those expectations. If your expectations are so low that you think the natural condition of a human society is oppression by the elites and violence and war, then you would be very impressed by the American model. And I think that's why those of us who are impressed by it are impressed by it. Our fundamental expectations are lower, not higher.
We have lower expectations of mankind.
Yes, and as we should. I mean, look at mankind, right? And in that sense, there's no doubt that classical liberalism offers an extraordinary exception to human history, whereas the revolutions are actually more in line with the usual way things go. But there is I think there is an important expectation at the end of that revolutionary promise, so that surely the violence is enough for some people, but I do think that part of the appeal, the breadth of the appeal, is also about what it promises.
But what if the parameters are different? What if it's not about expectation, but about temperament? To be over-reductive, what if there are people, I don't know if it's a more cultural or individualistic thing, but if there are people who are more drawn to the preservation of life, and there are those who are more drawn to the redemptive power of death, because death is powerful. Death is not just, this evil thing of I want to inflict pain on people. No, death is profound. Death is the ultimate assertion of power, and I can see how in the hearts of many spiritually inclined people, relating to death is the closest they get to the divine. So I can see how that has throughout history been associated with deep faith. But what if for the people who prefer life, the people who want to preserve life, for them, compromise is essential. The only way you preserve life is by developing systems like pluralism, where we grow sophisticated social mechanisms that allow us to disagree and hate each other without bringing destruction upon each other's houses, without resulting with a Romeo and Juliet, right? That is the evolution, the institutional evolution, to use your conservative logic, that leads us to pluralism. Fundamentally, it is about a prioritization of life, of living, of thriving in the material world. Whereas a person who believes that the material world itself is fundamentally imperfect and death is redemptive, there is never going to be a real tomorrow. It's not about that tomorrow it's not that their expectations of a tomorrow are so high. It is that they are constantly pushing their expectations higher, because ultimately what they want is salvation from this fallen world.
Well, I think that is too unfair to the people I disagree with. There are surely people who answer to the description that you offer, but I think there are probably also people who answer to the worst kind of caricature we could draw of conservatives too. Most people don't, I think. I don't think that the left in the West is fundamentally a party of death. I think that in a sense, the differences have to do with what you understand to be the primary social danger and problem. That if you think that the evil to be overcome by politics is the danger of social breakdown and chaos and disorder and barbarism, then you're likely to prefer order and to be willing to compromise for it and to be a conservative. If you think the biggest obstacle to human happiness is oppression of the weak by the strong, then you're likely to want to overturn the social order for the sake of some idea of justice. And I think that when a lot of people on the left look out at the world, they see it beset by problems created by the oppression of the weak by the strong. And when a lot of conservatives look out at the world, we see it as beset by problems created by the breakdown of social order. And sometimes we look at the very same things, and I see barbarism and someone on the left sees oppression. We look at crime in the cities, and I just naturally identify with the police officer taking a risk to protect my safety, and another person will naturally identify with the kid looting the store because he's never had a chance. And I think those are both at some level plausibly defensible morally, but I think my view is more correct about human nature, and that acting on it would lead to a better society. But I guess I don't think of myself as locked in a battle with the agents of death. Maybe I'm giving them too much credit.
To be clear, I don't think that the majority of progressives are actually there, but I think there is a spiraling temptation.
Yep.
And at the end of it, there is Jacobinism. And increasingly, I think, partly because of the ineffectuality of blue cities and the sense that everything that we try is stymied, while at the same time, most of those people experiencing mostly material comfort, the people who are fantasizing about revolution mostly experience material comfort. I think that creates that temptation more and more seductive. I mean, maybe it's just the fact that I came of age during the Second Intifada that I'm very acutely worried about the seductive power of death. How do we reignite cultural continuity? Like how do you said, so persuasion is our main tool. Although in the lecture you mentioned it needs to be the complete picture of culture and politics. What should we be actively involved in order to make people regain some confidence?
First of all, we have to engage in some work that makes our traditions attractive to the rising generation. We shouldn't expect that to happen on its own. And that we shouldn't expect young people to love things that aren't lovely. And that means that requires an educational effort. It requires a commitment to a culture of beauty and truth and confidence. And we don't always do that. I think we on the right, who are the defenders of continuity, have let ourselves get too defensive and too whiny. And it's just not attractive. I had the great benefit of teachers who made the tradition exciting and engaging and gave me the clear impression that they believed that it was the most beautiful possession we have. And I think we owe that to the next generation, to be such teachers, to be such guides. That's incumbent on us. I also do think, though, that we have to engage in a fight in the political arena with the partisans of discontinuity, with the people who want to undermine the institutions that make it possible for our culture to survive and thrive. Those people are out there, and they really do want to overthrow these institutions, and we really do need to defend them. Our political institutions, to make the case for the Constitution and to fight for it in electoral politics and in the courts and in everywhere we can. Our cultural institutions, our social and religious institutions. We have to be conservatives. In other words, I mean, I think that's that shouldn't be too surprising a prescription, I guess, but it's not as obvious as it should be.
I want to ask you two things about this. First, the political side. I intimated that I actually don't think that my criticism is strictly towards the left. I think there are some annihilationist tendencies on the right as well. But even putting that question aside, there is certainly a power movement on the right that seems to be more concerned with dominance than with reconstruction. How, as a leading voice on the right, as a prominent thinker on conservatism, where did the right go wrong in that sense, and can it be stirred back?
I think conservatives in America have allowed themselves to become too despairing about the condition of our society. There's a lot to worry about, but there's also a lot to be proud of and protective of. And I think we have leaned too far in the direction of despair to be capable enough of protection and conservation. And a politics of despair, of saying, look, if this next election goes the wrong way, then the sky will fall, ultimately leads you to a place where you're incapable of defending your society's inheritance. And
is despair inherently contradictory to conservatism?
Yes, I think despair is inherently contradictory to conservatism. Yeah. I think conservatives, by the logic of our own way of life, should be hopeful. And it's because we have low expectations, right? It's because we don't assume everything will always go well that we shouldn't be despairing when things go poorly. We should understand that this is what we have been handed. Every generation of our society has had to deal with some very significant and terrible crisis, has had to wonder whether this experiment can survive. What we're trying to do in America is very difficult. And we've always had to worry about whether we can sustain it the way the previous generation did. You know, our national anthem in America is not a song about how beautiful our country is. It's a song about barely surviving the night. And I think it's perfectly appropriate that be our national anthem. The fact that the flag is still there is in some ways the most amazing thing about us. And I think we've got to be able to see that making sure that's still the case is very, very important to do. And you know, the cause of that kind of conservation does require hopefulness. It does require confidence. And we should also be able to see the good alongside the bad. It is just simply not the case that everything has gotten worse in America since the middle of the 20th century. Some things have gotten worse, and we need to work on that. And some things have gotten better, and we should take some pride in those. I think the failure to see those and acknowledge them, it's not just a failure, but I would say it's viewed as a failure of nerve now to say that not everything is terrible. And that's just crazy. That's a crazy place to be. You cannot approach the rising generation and say everything is terrible. That's not going to be a winning argument. And that is essentially the post-liberal argument that there's nothing here to defend. There's nothing here worth your while. We need to do something else. That's just crazy, and it's wrong, and it needs to be answered in its own terms. So I think part of what's going on here is we've been driven crazy by a 50-50 politics in which the stakes of individual elections are vastly over-exaggerated, and in which it seems as though despair is the only way forward. I don't think it has to be this way. I also don't think this is working. As a political strategy, it hasn't worked, right? The right has not, in fact, been able to patch together a durable majority coalition in America for a generation. And that should suggest that the strategy we're trying isn't working. But somehow today's right is able to persuade itself that the country's going to hell, but everything's going great in our politics. We've found the formula. Well, no, I don't think that's right at all. You win 49% of the vote. You should ask yourself what's wrong, not how do we keep doing this? And somehow that's not the question we're asking.
So what would you like to see? Would you like to see new universities that teach civics and art and
yes, and
tradition?
We're seeing some of that. I think we're seeing some changes in the academy that point in this direction. It's very hard to do, but there are new universities. There are new institutions within existing universities that take it as their educational mission to build a kind of civic self-confidence and love of country. I think that's a wonderful thing. And that's a key piece of what I would want to see. Absolutely.
Can you give me an example for something our audience
I
pay
think
attention
that the schools of civic thought in some key red state universities in the last 10 years, and Arizona State was the first one, but now at the University of Texas and University of Florida and University of North Carolina and Ohio State, these are important public educational institutions, and they've taken it upon themselves to take seriously the intellectual side of American civics and to treat civic thought as a serious intellectual purpose. I think that's tremendously helpful. It's a great sign. It's the best thing that's happened in the American Academy in a very long time.
So my last question is about the culture side, specifically about art. I mentioned my artist friend, Ken Goshen. He's a classically styled illustrator, a style of art that is practically being considered antediluvian now in the art world. But we get into many discussions on where art went wrong. And he actually introduced me to Edmund Burke 15 years ago when he gave me his book on the sublime. He sees the problem as moving away from beauty as a value.
Yes.
And you did mention beauty, and we even talked about beauty in the context of Burke on our last conversation. What do you think of that? Do you think that there's such a thing as beauty that we have just neglected as a value culturally?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there is. I cling to the classical notion that beauty and truth are related to each other, and that beauty is a pathway to truth. It's a way of reaching it because it's hard to reach. And yeah, I think that an elite intellectual art world that rejects that as its purpose makes itself worse than useless as art. And the public still wants beautiful things. There is still, I think, a widely shared sense that the beautiful has to be part of what our culture has to offer. And it's a sense that shows itself now and then, but it's resisted by the practitioners of art in our society in a way that makes it very difficult for that hunger to be met, to be fed. And yeah, I think that's absolutely a piece of the story. It's related to these other pieces.
How do you understand that moving away from beauty?
Well, I mean, I think that it's connected to a desire to escape the kind of oppressive standards of beauty and of truth that was a form of nihilism over the last 150 years. And the sense that art that is subservient to some idea of beauty is the only real art was seen as an overly constraining and oppressive idea that serves the status quo, and it was rejected along with a lot of other important things on that basis.
Since we started with an extended talk in the abstract, let's conclude with that. We started talking about what conservatism is. Let's conclude with what beauty is. So your understanding is that the trend was away from a universally recognized beauty, not a trend towards redefining what beauty is.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think these things are related, but I would say that it's a move toward a trend that says that beauty is entirely subjective, and in that sense, can be anything. I do think that's fundamentally a move away from some kind of external standard of beauty, objective standard of beauty. As a practical matter, it can certainly be a way of saying, that anything is beautiful and therefore that nothing is.
So bringing the top and the end together, closing this loop, how do you reconcile your intuitive understanding of beauty as related to truth as this universal value, which is now being rejected by the contemporary art world, with your sense that as a society, we do evolve parochially and locally?
Yeah. Well, again, I think we don't have direct access to the highest truth. We have indirect access to it. We have indirect access to it through forms, through cultural forms, political forms, through the forms of the historic lives of societies, and also through some intellectual forms. This is a very old idea, and it suggests that because of our limitations, the limits that constrain us from directly knowing the whole of the truth, we have to approach it by way of various kinds of unavoidably local and parochial forms. But they are ways of approaching that truth, it seems to me.
So it's a difference of goal. Rather than saying that we should just reject the idea that such a universal convergence exists, we should accept that we are seeking to get there, but our journey there is through our multifarious paths.
Yeah, I think it's possible to look at beautiful things made by the culture of India and beautiful things made by the culture of France and say, these are aiming at something similar, even though there's not much similar about them on the surface. They all arise from a desire for beauty and truth that we can recognize in ourselves,
as opposed to Soviet architecture.
Yeah, which expresses a kind of rejection of that very desire.
Yuval, thank you so much for joining me in this seminar.
Thank you.
I'll see you next time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're feeling generous, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.